Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Manvir Singh. He is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Toulouse, France. We've already done an interview. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of this one. And today we're going to talk about a recent paper of his, Human Social Organization during the Late Pleistocene Beyond the Nomadic-Egalitarian Model. So, Dr. Singh, welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ricardo.
So, could you please start by telling us what the nomadic-egalitarian model is?
Yeah, so the nomadic-egalitarian model is a term that Luke Lowacki and I use to describe the prevailing view of human social organization before 10,000 years ago. So this is before the Holocene, before the agricultural revolution, and it's the idea that for the vast majority of our species' history, we lived in small bands on the scale of 25 or so people. And these bands were mobile, they were relatively egalitarian, they had weak notions of property, little hierarchy, no large-scale cooperation, so no cooperation that involves tens or hundreds of individuals. Rather, this idea that they are small-scale, they are mobile, they're egalitarian.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, you're talking there about bands of 20 to 25 people, but isn't it the case that anthropologists also within this nomadic egalitarian model framework, let's say, also talk about tribes which should be groups of bands and so larger societies?
Yes, exactly, yeah. So there is an acknowledgement that these bands, which may have a median or a mean size of 25 individuals, exist within larger ethno-linguistic tribes, which can be hundreds, even like the low thousands. But most social interactions are occurring under the nomadic egalitarian model within these bands, and sometimes with other individuals in other bands, but within the same ethno-linguistic tribe.
Mm-hmm. So, and where does the idea of this nomadic and egalitarian hunter-gatherer model comes from?
Yeah, so there are, I think, many historical findings, many observations that contribute to the nomadic egalitarian model, but the simplest and the most important is that when anthropologists look around at the world, when you survey the world's foraging societies, and especially when people were doing this in the 1960s, when there was an attempt to really synthesize this knowledge, what they saw was that most hunter-gatherers seem to live in small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands. So this is the case especially for independently living African hunter-gatherers, people like the Kung of the Kalahari or the Hadza, who were believed to be especially relevant for reconstructing Pleistocene Paleolithic societies. So on the basis of these modern hunter-gatherers, it was very easy to infer that our pre-agricultural ancestors, who would also be hunter-gatherers, who would also be foragers, also lived in these small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands. So I think that is the main observation, the fact that most foragers look like that, especially these focal studies, or these focal societies, like the Kung, like the Hadza.
Mm-hmm. But but is it that anthropologists add or have that general idea just by looking at these examples of societies, or is it that by looking across the world into different hunter-gatherer societies, they still find or think that's the correct model? I mean, is it just a small sampling, or is it that even by looking across the globe, they still think that's true?
So it's both. So it is, when you look across the globe and you look at what hunter-gatherers look like, at first it seems like the vast majority live in these small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands. So we look at foragers in South America, we see the Inuit, we see some Australian groups, and then we see especially these African foragers. So I think it's this combination, both the overall landscape and these these particular societies that people really focused on. Although, and so this is something we might get to later, it is the case that when you start to look at the diversity even of these mobile foragers, you see more social diversity than I think is acknowledged within the nomadic egalitarian band. But I imagine this is something we'll get to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, because I was just trying to understand, I mean, because I know that historically in anthropology there are several ideas that have been mainstream just because certain particular very influential anthropologists focused on their work on particular societies. I mean, Margaret Mead comes to mind, for example, and then for some reason, because they were very influential, those ideas just stuck. So I was just trying to understand if in this case it was something along those lines, or even if after looking across the globe, that's still the most prevailing idea, or not.
Yeah, so there was, and in I have this Aeon essay on the topic, and in there I really focus on the Harvard Kalahari project, which was an incredible feat of anthropological research that drew in demographers and psychologists and ethnographers that studied everything from trance to blood pressure. And that really focused on this group, the Kalahari Kung. And from that project, the Kalahari Kung essentially became many people's stand-in for both hunter-gatherers and the Paleolithic. So as you said, I think there were some really influential projects that put the model at the forefront. But then also when anthropologists surveyed many societies, I have it, well, we can come back to it, but when they surveyed societies in, I think, 1967 during this conference, Man the Hunter, this was a collection of hunter-gatherer experts in an attempt to synthesize what we know about hunter-gatherers. And from there, you also had this notion, I think it was called the generalized forager model or something like that. I can look it up in a second. But that echoed the observations of the Kalahari project, that the modal social organization, the typical social organization for foragers was mobile, relatively egalitarian, small groups, weak notions of property.
So another question, and I think this is important because it might have implications for things we will talk about later. When people came up with this model, was it just because of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies they studied, or they were also already looking into past hunter-gatherer societies and they still arrived at the same model? I mean, I was trying to understand here if this idea comes from just contemporary hunter-gatherers or also some, I don't know, archaeological studies of ancient hunter-gatherers, for example.
Yeah, so the thing that I think is very important to recognize is that our understanding or our observations of recent hunter-gatherers influences or guides how we interpret archaeological findings. Yeah. So in that way, I think the observations of these recent foragers were important both for influencing the model, and insofar as there were archaeological findings that informed the model, those were interpreted again through this lens. One thing that I want to point out is that even at that time, however, there was this conference, Man the Hunter, and that produced this book, also called Man the Hunter. And there was a recognition that people were really focusing, and again, this is something we'll get to, but people were really focusing on hunter-gatherers that lived in marsh or marginal habitats or harsh environments, and that some foragers who lived in other environments potentially had features that violated this model. And so that has been a theme, and people hunter-gatherer specialists have long observed that. There was a book in 1985 that really thought about complexity among hunter-gatherers. But even so, even in 1967, even while they recognized that they were focusing on these hunter-gatherers that lived in marginal or harsh environments, and that there was more diversity in other habitats, they still produced this generalized model at that time.
So I guess you understand why I was asking you this question, because it could just so happen that the kinds of hunter-gatherers people studied recently and that existed recently and perhaps still exist nowadays were pushed to certain environments and ecological conditions that are exceptional when looking back into our evolutionary history, and so they wouldn't be representative of the kinds of societies we really evolved in, right?
Yes. And so this is, I think, a big part of the argument that we are making and that other people have acknowledged. And again, they acknowledged that in 1967, that, okay, yeah, we are looking at a small subset of hunter-gatherers, of those hunter-gatherers who are living today, and even so produce this model. And I think, to be fair, hunter-gatherer experts and archaeologists have quite a nuanced view of hunter-gatherer social diversity. I think what is important to recognize is that this early work in hunter-gatherer studies then really influenced how evolutionary scholars, how social scientists more generally thought of the Pleistocene. And so I think the literature in hunter-gatherer studies has really come to embrace diversity and think about the role of ecology. But I think that has had less impact in informing our models of Pleistocene social organization, and especially of leaking into the evolutionary literature more broadly and in the social sciences, more broadly outside of that.
Yeah, and we will probably also get a little bit into some assumptions people like evolutionary psychologists make based on those models, but we'll get into that later. But I mean, is the nomadic egalitarian model, or do you think it is still mostly a right idea or not?
Yeah, so that depends on what you mean. Do I think that pre-agricultural societies mostly lived in small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands? Like, do I think that the majority of humans before agriculture lived in small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands? I'm not sure, and I actually think it's reasonable to conclude that that is not the case, and we can go into that more later. Do I think that many recent hunter-gatherers, many foraging societies, for instance, studied by anthropologists, do I think that many of them lived in small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands? Yes, to a degree, although Luke, my co-author, and others have argued that even these recent foragers have exhibited more social diversity than the nomadic egalitarian model permits.
Okay. And what aspects of our evolution or evolutionary history does this model or the alternative model you present in the paper or propose in the paper that we're going to talk about inform?
Yeah, so the first is that it broadly informs the arc of human history. If the nomadic egalitarian model is correct, then many features of contemporary societies are novel, they are puzzling. Hierarchy, cooperation with strangers, large groups. And then connected to that, and this maybe connects more to your question, the nomadic egalitarian model, or any model of pre-Holocene lifeways, of Pleistocene lifeways, informs our understanding of human social and behavioral evolution. What is the social environment to which we are psychologically adapted? If, for most of our species' history, we lived in small, mobile, relatively egalitarian bands, then our evolved psychology is adapted to that context. We are adapted to living in a mostly egalitarian environment. We are adapted to societies with weak notions of property. We're adapted to cooperating on a small scale. And in that same way, dominance, large-scale cooperation, identifying with huge faceless groups, these are just puzzling behaviors that seem to have emerged in the last 10,000 years somehow.
Yeah, and that gets us, and perhaps to get now early into some of the implications of that kind of thinking, that gets us, for example, into the concept that many evolutionary psychologists use, for example, of evolutionary mismatches, that perhaps some of them wouldn't be so or wouldn't apply because, I mean, in particular aspects at least, perhaps our more modern, industrialized, hierarchical, sedentary societies are not that distanced from the kinds of societies we evolved in. Right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So depending on our model of the Pleistocene, some behaviors are either consistent with our evolutionary history or at least consistent with the kind of variation we encountered during our evolutionary history, or they are total mismatches. So if the nomadic egalitarian model is correct, then social hierarchy, large-scale cooperation, large-scale group identity, all of these are foreign to our nature. All of these are features of our modern environment that are mismatched to our evolutionary history.
Mm-hmm. So tell us now about the model you propose, what you call the diverse histories model.
Okay, yeah. So it's a simple idea. It is just this idea that there was much more diversity during the late Pleistocene. And again, we restrict ourselves to the late Pleistocene because it becomes harder to know what earlier time periods were like. So maybe I can just give a quick timeline for your listeners, which is we are currently in the Holocene. The Holocene started about 11,700 years ago. It is a time of warming. It's the time of agriculture. Before the Holocene was the Pleistocene, and the Pleistocene goes back about 2.5 million years. The final age of the Pleistocene is known as the Upper Pleistocene or the Late Pleistocene. And the Late Pleistocene started about 125, 130,000 years ago. So what we are arguing is, and again, we're just sticking to the Late Pleistocene because there's more uncertainty the farther we go. But we're arguing that, yes, just as some societies during the Late Pleistocene were small, mobile, egalitarian, others were large, with communities in the hundreds, maybe even low thousands, so single communities on that scale. Some were sedentary or semi-sedentary. There was social hierarchy. There may have been small chiefdoms, even proto-states. There were potentially things that we are less uncomfortable with during our history, potentially warfare, but also potentially a greater scope for peace, potentially even something like slavery. So I can go into the logic of our argument, why we make this argument. Should I do that?
Yes, and please also tell us about the kinds of sources you draw from to make this argument and present this model. I mean, do you base your argument here on some contemporary societies, also on archaeological evidence, both? I mean, how does it work exactly?
Yeah, okay. So I'll present the logic and I'll touch upon the evidence, but if anything feels missing, just let me know.
Okay.
So our argument has a couple of components. First, we just point out that recent foragers, the ones that are most often considered inspiration for the nomadic egalitarian model, exhibit much more diversity than the nomadic egalitarian model permits. So even mobile foragers had much more variable group size. They sometimes had coercive authority. They were capable of large-scale cooperation, and this especially comes from a really nice review done by Pete Richardson and Rob Boyd on large-scale cooperation in mobile foragers. So one point is simply that many widespread stories about Pleistocene lifeways actually just end up misrepresenting even the small mobile foragers that we know. But the other point that we make is that when we look at recent hunter-gatherers, so when we look at both those observed by anthropologists, those for which we have ethnographic observations, and those that from archaeology we know lived earlier in the Holocene and even at the end of the Pleistocene, the tail end of the Pleistocene, we find that societies living in environments with rich, dense, reliable resources, so especially societies that subsist on coastal resources or riverine resources, they tend to violate the nomadic egalitarian model. They are sedentary, They have much larger groups, villages sometimes above 1,000 people. They have hierarchy. They even have slavery in some cases. So the best known examples are the peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast in North America, peoples like the Haida, the Tlingit, but there are many other incredible examples, even from the last couple hundred years, that missionaries, explorers, and anthropologists have studied. So these include coastal foragers in New Guinea, the Calusa of Florida, the Chumash of California. And so in our paper, Luke and I provide a long list of examples of these low mobility and hierarchical foragers, low mobility and non-egalitarian foragers, both from anthropological observations and from archaeology. We find them in North America, South America, Europe, East Asia, Australia, and really importantly, in Africa. So that is just the first logical point we are making, that when hunter-gatherers live in environments with dense, rich, reliable resources, they built these larger, less mobile, more hierarchical societies. So now what we also know, and this has been emerging over the last couple of decades, is that peoples have been exploiting these kinds of rich, reliable resources for at least 120,000 years. And this comes from work by people like Curtis Marion. For a long time, for much of the 20th century, there was this thought that people didn't start to exploit coastal and riverine resources until very recently, such as the Holocene. But we now know that peoples were intensively exploiting shellfish, river fish, lake margins for tens of thousands of years. You know, Curtis Marion has this evidence at around, I forget, somewhere between 120 and 130,000 years ago. So it's this combination that is really important for us. This recognition from behavioral ecology that foragers build larger, less mobile, more hierarchical societies in particular environments when subsisting on particular resources, and this new view that humans have been exploiting these kinds of resources for the entirety of the late Pleistocene. And there are some indications of larger groups of low mobility in the African archaeological record, but we are more going on this kind of logical combination.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so this diverse histories model does not exclude completely the nomadic egalitarian model. I mean, it includes it in it. It just says that, okay, this is not the only model of society or the only kind of society we evolved in. We basically evolved and are, I mean, I'm not sure if we should use the word adapted here or not, please tell me, but perhaps we are more flexible in terms of the kinds of societies we can adapt to and live in.
Exactly. Yeah, that human societies during the Holocene, during the late Pleistocene, or during the very tail end of the Pleistocene, and in modern observations, human forager societies really vary depending on their ecology, and they have exploited a huge variety of ecologies throughout human history, and so we can then make the inference that their societies have been similarly diverse. A point that I want to make, though, and so I completely agree with what you said, that it includes the nomadic egalitarian model and sees it as a part, or sees that as a part of a larger subset of social diversity. Mm-hmm. One important point, though, is that a single society that is large, that is super dense, has many, many people. And so in our paper, we provide this example. We say, imagine a landscape that has 500 patches, 500 equally sized patches. And if 499 of them are inhabited by people living at the density of the Kalahari Kung, and only one is inhabited by a group that lives at the density of the Calusa or of these New Guinean foragers. So, 499 are filled by Kung, one is filled by a New Guinean forager. Still, 1/4 of all humans live in that single dense patch. So even if most were nomadic egalitarian, even a small number of people living in super dense, relatively large societies will mean that they constitute quite a large proportion of human population, and thus a significant a significant environment for psychological adaptation, psychological flexibility.
Okay, so I think this is an important question, probably a very difficult one to answer, but I always try to ask it to all anthropologists I get on the show. I mean, do we know exactly what predicts how human societies get structured as more or less mobile, more or less hierarchical, more or less egalitarian, for example? I mean, is it really completely predicted by the sort of ecological conditions each society finds itself in? Or, I mean, does it have some more, let's say, evolutionary predispositions to it? Or is it cultural? I mean, because there's always this ongoing debate between, let's say, ecology, evolutionary adaptations, culture, and so on. So, I mean, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, and also to contextualize this question, so Luke and I released our preprint earlier last year, and then later in the year, David Wengrow and David Graeber published this book, The Dawn of Everything. And The Dawn of Everything, if you're familiar, makes some similar arguments. It similarly argues that there was much more social diversity or social flexibility. But a fundamental difference, I think, between our argument is that, and their argument is that they reject the predictive power of behavioral ecology. They predict that, or they reject this premise that a society's form shall reflect its ecology, which I think actually makes it difficult to make inferences or to draw this analogy to the past. But so I would just say that I definitely do not think it's deterministic. I definitely don't think that, if you are in ecology A, that means you will have social features B. But I do think it is, so sorry, I hope I said it's not deterministic, but I do think it is predictive that if you are in a particular environment, then we can predict, the likelihood is higher that you will exhibit a particular social structure. And again, if you look in our paper, we have the table where we list all of these. I'm just pulling it up for my own, to remind myself. We have this table where we have all of these low mobility, non-egalitarian foragers. And we list the environment in which they appeared. And something that's so striking is that, I don't know the proportion right now, but it's probably like 90% of these live in environments with coastal or aquatic resources. They're subsisting on fish, they're subsisting on riparian resources, lake resources. It's really staggering. And this actually surprised me, even in going through this, just how reliably it seems when you survey the archaeological and ethnographic research that these environments, these environments with aquatic resources give rise to low mobility and sometimes non-egalitarian foragers. So I definitely would not say that it's deterministic. I would say that it's predictive. And I don't think that culture is in opposition to ecology. Through cultural evolution, people can develop technologies that better allow them to exploit their resources, and in so doing, I think, provide the conditions for these larger, denser, less mobile groups. Mm-hmm. But of course, I do think history is important. I mean, once you get into these kinds of environments, societies can have different histories. I don't want to reject that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about agriculture? Because I mean, we usually tend to think that until about, 11,000, 13,000 years ago, people were just subsisting on foraging. They were hunter-gatherers, and then suddenly they discovered certain species of plants that they were able to harvest, and they became sedentary and developed agricultural societies. And before that, they didn't have any sort of agriculture whatsoever. But that's not really the case, is that it?
Yeah. So I think there are two lines of evidence that should lead us to question that story. The first is that many ethnographically observed foragers had pretty sophisticated plant and animal management techniques. So they did broadcast sowing of seeds, they would weed, they would transplant tubers, they would enclose animals, they would transport entire animal populations. Um, yeah, so just on the basis of observations of recent foragers, I think we should attribute a greater capacity for research management, for cultivation, for animal management. The second is that there is just increasing evidence that the process of domestication goes back farther than we expected, and there are like intriguing findings. So the case study that I like the best, and I should acknowledge that this is still debated, but are these findings from this Israeli site, Ohalo 2. Ohalo 2. And over there, Ohalo 2 is an incredible site. It should have never been discovered because it was a fisher-forager camp, I think 23 or 24,000 years ago in what is now Israel. The lake rose, it submerged the camp, and in the late 1980s, because Israel was pumping out water, the camp becomes exposed, and a passerby just happens to see it and reports it to the Archaeological Society, and they immediately start a dig, and there we find evidence of weeds, and we find evidence of incipient genetic change, incipient domestication, and this is, more than 12,000 years, more than 13,000 years earlier than the supposed onset of agriculture. So I think there's much reason to believe that humans have long been cultivating resources, and more reason even to suspect that there has been some domestic change. And even when people are starting to look at the genetics of domesticated species, there are indications that this process goes deeper. I mean, dogs even were domesticated in the Pleistocene.
Mm-hmm. So, talking about our evolved psychology specifically, what kind of implications do you think your diverse histories model would have? Of course, we could get here into considerations about, I don't know, for example, recent work done by Joseph Henrich and colleagues, where basically, there's very compelling evidence that perhaps just thinking that we have sort of Stone Age minds and for the last 10,000 years or something like that, nothing changed and culture doesn't matter that much. Perhaps that's not really the best or correct way of thinking about things. But just putting that aside for a bit, do you think that it would have important implications for how we think about our evolved psychology?
Yeah. And I think the point that you just made about did evolution stop 10,000 years ago? To what extent is there ongoing gene culture coevolution is an important one, and I agree that the story is more complicated. So what are the implications for our stories about, or our understanding of, our evolved psychology? So in the paper, I think there are many implications because the nomadic-egalitarian model has really guided the evolutionary study of behavior. In the paper, we discuss, I think, 4. Dominance and status seeking, large-scale group identity, intergroup relations, so peace and warfare, and then just more generally thinking about the scope for gene culture coevolution during the Pleistocene. So is there any of those 4 that you would want to dig into?
Let's try to go through all of them, but perhaps dominance and status-seeking behaviors, because that's a very, very big theme in evolutionary psychology, for example.
Yeah, so what we argue is that under the nomadic egalitarian model, it's very difficult to explain human dominance behaviors. Bullies should have been executed. You should not have had the ecological conditions to support differences in wealth or coercive ability. There should have been much selection, there should have been ridicule, there should have been all of these mechanisms to curb dominance behaviors. They should have been selected against many millennia ago. Yet humans clearly come into the world prepared to seek and recognize dominance. So babies presumably organize social interactions in terms of dominance. And so what we argue quite simply is that status-seeking behaviors, not only dominance, but also the drive for prestige, for rank, have long been a feature of human societies, and as a result have really importantly shaped our psychology. And just a quick aside, when I have given this talk before, I've once had the response that, well, humans may have lived in egalitarian societies where dominance was selected against, but we may inherit dominance behaviors from a chimp-like ancestor. Maybe that is an artifact or a relic of a deeper evolutionary history. To that, I would say that dominance behaviors appear to be flexible. They're flexible on an individual level, inter-individually. And it is also clear that humans have undergone tremendous and incredible behavioral evolution since diverging from the last common ancestors with chimpanzees. We're a cultural language-using species. The idea that many other behaviors should have been flexible in their evolutionary history, while dominance behaviors should have just persisted because of phylogenetic inertia, I don't find very compelling.
Mm-hmm. What about a group identity then? Because this might have some implications in terms of, how limited people's thinking are about how much we can extend, or the number of people to which we can extend our identity, and perhaps even some implications into about the limits of that, if it's possible, for example, to develop an identity in common with millions of people, with billions of people potentially, and just to use Peter Singer's term, expanding our moral circles, for example.
Yeah, so I think it is clear that people do have the ability to identify with millions of people, to use a relevant and also very tragic case. We can look at Ukraine, where there is clearly a shared identity on a scale of millions of people that is motivating ostensibly people to cooperate. We have what appear to be a very incredible, very impressive ability to identify with groups of anonymous strangers on staggering scales, merely on the basis of what Yarrow Denham just calls it mere membership. You give someone a t-shirt, whatever. And so this is puzzling. If we evolved in small groups, if we cooperated with a small number of people, you wouldn't think that it's so easy to hack and manipulate our in-group psychology. People should be very attuned to simply tracking the individuals who comprise their group and being very careful to cooperate with them. But if humans sometimes cooperated on a large scale with hundreds, even low thousands of people, then I think it makes much more sense that we should have this kind of flexible groupish psychology that can be triggered merely on the basis of group identity cues. I actually find it very difficult to understand these kinds of behaviors under a nomadic egalitarian model.
Mm-hmm. So, and now gene culture, coevolution, and human social psychology, what are the implications for that?
Yeah, so the idea there is that there is just an expanded scope for coevolution between social institutions and our social psychology. So if we reliably built societies with particular social institutions or cultural features, then there is an opportunity for those to have in turn impacted our psychology. If, for example, we regularly have large groups with social or economic differentiation, then we may have evolved adaptations for signaling and interpreting class-based identity. If we had societies that developed enforcement mechanisms for ensuring cooperation on very large scales, then we should have accordingly evolved adaptations to flexibly respond to those kinds of large-scale cooperative cues. So the idea is simply that there is an expanded scope for the role of social institutions in shaping our flexible social psychology.
Mm-hmm. About intergroup relationships, I would like to ask you more specifically about intergroup conflict and even more specifically about war, because there's a big debate. I mean, I'm not sure if anthropologists in general or there are some of them that might agree with Steven Pinker when it comes to the reading of the archaeological record when it comes to intergroup conflict and war, or if the vast majority of them are on the side of Brian Ferguson and others that argue that his argument is just based on very limited samples from very limited places across the globe, and they can't really tell us anything about if they were really waging war against one another and how common was it before agricultural societies developed and state societies. So, I mean, does that allow for us to have another kind of understanding about how that might have operated back then?
Yeah. So you're pointing to a debate that plays out very popularly in the public discourse, and I think it's also actually echoed in the anthropological literature. So I think there are some people who would really argue that war has been a characteristic of human evolutionary history. Others, like Douglas Fry, for instance, would argue that it's more peace. So the clear observation is that hunter-gatherers, even recent hunter-gatherers, clearly engaged in both, and that's how these two camps can make their arguments. Like Fry can look at particular groups of mobile foragers and show that they are very peaceful. Others can look at mobile foragers that live next to other foragers, or they can in particular look at peoples like the peoples of the Pacific Northwest and show that they engaged in warfare. So the clear observation is that even recent hunter-gatherers engaged in both. They were clearly flexible. They were clearly capable of engaging sometimes in cooperative relationships with outgroup neighbors, but also of killing them and treating them like not humans or taking slaves. I don't know if I should say treating them like not humans, but having a different word for them, or even taking slaves. So what Luke and I argue, and Luke has actually been a part of this literature, Luke, among his interests, works on intergroup conflict. But what we argued quite reasonably, I think, is that the impulse for our history to have either been one of war or one of peace is misplaced. That instead, our history was likely much more varied, that people sometimes engaged in war, they sometimes engaged in trade, and so our intergroup psychology is probably much more flexible as well.
Yeah, and perhaps some of the debate also stems from what people understand to be war, right? Because, I mean, there are people that say that war, really what we should consider war is just some organized way. I mean, we would have to be able to mobilize men forcefully to engage in it, and so we would need some sort of state organization to do that, and it would have been impossible in prehistoric times. For example, it would just have been something like raiding. But I mean, what do you think about that?
I would say that foragers, recent foragers, seem to have exhibited both raiding and what we might think of more as war. So they clearly had small raids. You know, individuals go out, or a small group goes out, and they opportunistically kill someone. But there are descriptions that look like large groups of individuals who are engaging in coordinated attacks on others. And so this is one of the examples that Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson point to in their paper on large-scale cooperation. So they point to these descriptions of Australian foragers who engaged in what looked like battle raids.
Right. So with the advent of large-scale agriculture-based societies, I mean, did human societies really change in very significant ways? Or, I mean, were there already elements present there that allowed for a much, let's say, smoother transition than people tend to think?
Yeah, so it depends on what variables we're looking at. The first thing I would say is that many of these sedentary and non-egalitarian foragers had group sizes and densities that overlap with agricultural societies. Many of them have group sizes and densities that exceed the group sizes and densities of some agricultural societies. That is the first thing I would say. The second thing is that if we are right under the diverse histories model, then many features of these societies would not have been novel. The hierarchy, the larger groups. Nevertheless, I would say that once you have agricultural societies with animal domesticates and with cereal agriculture, you have densities and group sizes that vastly exceed anything observed among hunter-gatherers. So just in terms of the scale, once you especially have cereal agriculture, you are capable of creating groups on a scale that is otherwise unprecedented. It seems. Mm-hmm. Which is a puzzle. It's like, why? Yeah, I think it's an interesting puzzle that I don't think we have resolved.
Mm-hmm. Can we build states, or are there examples of state societies that developed through means other than agriculture?
Yeah. The most stunning example are a people known as the Toulouse. And so they were the subject of my Aeon essay, and they also actually appeared in Graeber's and Wengrow's book, in their new book. But the Toulouse, they lived in southern Florida. They comprised 50 to 60 politically unified villages. I think their territory exceeded the size of Belgium by 2. I think it's twice the size of Belgium. They collected tribute from client villages. They had a king, a hereditary sovereign. And they seem to have done it all, stunningly enough, by subsisting not on agricultural resources, but on fish. And so, to be fair, there is evidence that I think they cultivated some papaya, but I think it was a trivial contribution to their diet. What they really seem to have done this on the basis of was fish. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, yeah, it looks like you can have tributary states.
Mm-hmm. What about what some people call the cognitive revolution that supposedly occurred some 75,000 to 40,000 years ago? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so if the question is, did humans undergo some biological genetic change some 75,000 to 40,000 years ago that resulted in behavioral modernity, I think 30 years ago, many anthropologists would have said, yes, definitely. Now, I think there is much more uncertainty. I think that many more anthropologists do not think that there was that kind of cognitive transformation. We know that many signs of behavioral modernity appeared much, much earlier. Instead, it seems like the kinds of changes we see in the archaeological records, say 40,000 years ago, are potentially the result of demographic changes. Perhaps you have larger, more interconnected groups. They can sustain higher cultural complexity. But I will say it's an unresolved issue. We just have much less certainty now than maybe we did 30 years ago that there was a cognitive revolution. Even though people like Yuval Harari will say that we have a cognitive revolution like it is accepted fact. Sorry, that was just a quick jab.
No, yeah. I understand that. And I also get it that probably many anthropologists get a little bit frustrated when some more popular writers get into their literature without enough expertise and then make big claims. I mean, just on my show several times I've been talking with anthropologists about some of the claims Steven Pinker makes in his books, for example, and I mean, many times they just don't agree with it. So, yeah, I mean, it's understandable on the one hand because, I mean, people don't have the expertise, they don't know how to evaluate evidence from something they're not specialized in, but at the same time, it's unfortunate that sometimes the books that get more popular are the ones that really make claims that are not really that well supported by the evidence. I mean, just to put that this comment out there because I think it's important for people to be aware of that. Anyway, okay, so just to go quickly again through your diverse histories model and comparing it to the more limited nomadic egalitarian model, because in your paper you present a figure basically summarizing it. So the nomadic egalitarian model is basically mobile, minimal food storage, terrestrial resources, egalitarian, minimized status competition, small groups, small scale cooperation, and then in your diverse histories model, that's also there, but then you also have societies that are more sedentary or semi-sedentary. They have food storage, aquatic resources, hierarchical, institutionalized status competition, large groups, and large-scale cooperation, correct?
Yeah, so in the newer version, I have removed food storage.
Oh, okay.
Um, I mean, it's trivial, but like I definitely think there was food storage. Yeah, but maybe more. I think popularly, many people don't think that mobile egalitarian peoples had food storage, but older ethnographies of the Kung clearly showed that they had food storage. So I didn't want to make. I just wanted to remove food storage from that figure.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. And would that have some kind of implications as to how we understand the model or not
No. I
really?
mean, it's like a small point. I mean, the model, regardless, says that food storage was potentially a part of human history, that it was included. And I think most people would not think that. I just, for like small reasons, just removed food storage from that particular figure.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything else to really ask about the paper. Since we still have time, I just wanted to ask you about another recent paper of yours where you talk about the basically evolution of fiction, the sympathetic plot, its psychological origins, and the implications of it for the evolution of fiction. So, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Over there, I am reviewing. So the paper first says that human societies regularly produce what I call the sympathetic plot. And the argument is that for the last 150 years, mythologists, folklorists, people interested in the history and diversity of narrative have converged on these different schema for narrative universals. The most famous is Joseph Campbell's monomyth, The Hero's Journey, but there are other versions. Booker has his 7 basic plots, Prop had his structure. And so what I am just saying is that actually all of these converge on a single paradigm, on a common structure that I call the sympathetic plot. And it, I think, will be very familiar to your viewers, but it's you have a protagonist or you have a character, they confront an obstacle, they overcome it, they reap rewards. And frequently that character starts out in distress. They might be an orphan, they might be the child of like rural poor folk. They will have some appealing traits. They might be physically attractive, strong, competent, helpful, kind. They will be potentially tied to prestige or status. So they might be an orphan but adopted by royalty. They might be a bullied younger sibling, or they might have been abandoned, but they're actually the child of a god, or there are prophecies about them. Their opponents are repulsive, and they go on an adventure. So this is probably every Disney movie. It's Star Wars, it's Harry Potter, it's Victorian novels, it's Russian folk tales, but then it's also folk tales and mythology from around the world. And I review some examples in that paper, and we're also doing a more systematic project right now where we're building a massive database of the world's mythology and folklore. So yeah, so I start with this observation that there is the sympathetic plot, and then I try to explain why is it? What is it about human psychology, about our evolved predispositions that leads the sympathetic plot to so reliably emerge? And what I argue is that it is tapping into two. Is this the kind of detail that you wanted?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So what I argue is that it is tapping into two features of our psychology. I argue that its function is to entertain, is to attract attention and ultimately evoke pleasure. And it does this by tapping into two sets of psychological mechanisms, two psychological processes. The first is that it appears to contain useful information about overcoming obstacles. So we humans are super attentive to information about someone overcoming an obstacle. And as soon as we hear about someone confronting an obstacle, or we see that, we want to know how they overcame it. It creates a feeling of suspense. So the general structure of protagonist confronts obstacle and tries to overcome it is just tapping into that. Then there's this question of why all these other features. Why are they an orphan? Why are they tied to high status? Why do they reap rewards, etc.? And the argument there is that it is tapping into psychological mechanisms that are designed for locating potential cooperative partners and allocating cooperative effort. So the idea is that we are looking out to figure out who is the best cooperative partner, and we want to interact with them. We want to cooperate with them. And so the protagonist of the sympathetic plot has all of the features that make someone a highly appealing cooperative partner. They are warm, so they're often kind, they're generous, they're also competent, so they're really good at stuff. You know, they can, whatever, fly, cut off someone's head, they're very good looking. And then they also suffer, or they start out in need, which evokes this feeling of empathy or sympathy, wanting to help them. And they often don't have other friends. So they don't have other cooperative partners that would elbow us out. And so, you know, it triggers these mechanisms for wanting to befriend them, for wanting to invest cooperative effort, and then it has them succeed. And the argument is that the success evokes the feeling of sympathetic joy, that we have this emotion, sympathetic joy, where we feel good when a cooperative beneficiary succeeds. And the sympathetic plot presents us with a potential cooperative beneficiary. It has them succeed, and it induces sympathetic joy. And people who have written about sympathetic joy argue that it is similar to the joy of sex or food. It is an outcome that is reliably good for fitness, and so it is intrinsically appealing. Like when cooperative partners succeed and we feel good, that motivates us to help them. And so, yeah, the argument is that this reliably developing structure of fitness is a way of hacking into our psychology. And it develops not because fiction is an adaptation, not because we have evolved to produce and share fiction, but rather it develops through cultural evolution as a kind of cheesecake, as a kind of drug to hack our psychology to provide us with something that we want. In this case, like joy and entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Do we also find this kind of plot in the oral traditions of traditional societies?
We do. Yeah, so this is what our project is investigating. In the paper, I cover some examples. I would say, though, that the sympathetic plot appears to be, if we look at like the 50 best-selling movies of all time, I'm sure that 45 of them will be the sympathetic plot exactly, and then 5 will be some variant. You know, the protagonist ultimately dies, but like everyone is happy because they killed a monster. They'll be very, very similar. When we look at the world's folklore, however, we see some versions of the sympathetic plot, but then we see a lot that is not the sympathetic plot. The most common is versions of ideological stories that might start out with the sympathetic plot and then violate it, or just origin myths that take on a different structure. And of course, we also have trickster stories. But I would say the world's oral literature is more diverse than, at least on this dimension, the dimension of the sympathetic plot, than our popular Western media.
Mm-hmm. But would you say that at least some elements of these stories are perhaps functional socially? I mean, in the sense that they transmit to you socially relevant information, particularly even more so to children?
So what are you thinking, like moral information?
Yeah, perhaps moral information and I don't know, in the case of the sympathetic plot, I would guess information about the kinds of people you should associate with, for example.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would acknowledge that that's a possibility. Well, I guess I'll say two things. One, I do think it's definitely the case that some stories are designed and propagated because they are vehicles for transmitting like moral information or some information. Like fables are a clear example of that. You know, many stories at the end say that is why we should not, you know, bully people or whatever. So I think some stories clearly exhibit that. Do I think the sympathetic plot more generally has that social function? I'm not sure. Um, my impulse would be to say that for the most part, those kinds of benefits are epiphenomenal. Um, that for the most part, when people are consuming and sharing the sympathetic plot, the fact that it's also communicating information about what like a good person is more an incidental consequence than it is the driving function. Although that's a hypothesis. I mean, one would have to figure out how to test that. But the reason I'm saying that is that if I think we can explain a cultural artifact purely on the basis of its psychological appeal, I don't think we need to invoke the added functional benefit. You know, I would wonder what is the added explanatory power that adding this functional benefit gives us.
Yeah, because I was just trying to get a sense of if you thought that perhaps stories in general tended to serve some sort of social function. I mean, not necessarily even communicating in their content relevant information, but perhaps other social functions, like, for example, just by people communicating them to one another, fomenting relationships or something like that. I mean, just trying to understand if stories perhaps are a little bit more functional than just being pleasurable, just being, I mean, something like cheesecake for the mind.
Yeah, I would say that even if the content is cheesecake, the way that it can be deployed can be for functional ends. So
Oh, okay.
a storyteller could tell stories for reputation. They could tell it because it like you said, potentially creates a bond. So yeah, so I think the content could be cheesecake, but the decision for people to deploy it, the context in which they deploy it could, and probably typically does reflect their own functional or strategic ends. You know, it's probably good for them in some way to tell it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be telling it. And I
Yeah.
also do think people would modify the content to satisfy other functional ends. You know, they, like I said earlier, they might modify the content to communicate a moral lesson.
Yeah, I'm asking you that because I mean, I guess that many times when in the social sciences people are trying to explain things through functional means, we have to try to look at functionality from different directions, not just if the content of what people transmit is functional itself, but if just by transmitting it, the act of transmitting it serves some, in this case, social function, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think a great point. It's an important point, and I agree that it's actually not considered often enough. I mean, even cheesecake, the decision for people to invest in and sell cheesecake is a reflection of their own strategic aims. Um, Nicolas Baumard and Pascal Boyer and Jean-Baptiste André actually have a new paper that is making this argument that we are not enough thinking about this, even when something is a byproduct. We should be thinking about the strategic aims of the individuals who are producing it and propagating it, which I think is a great point.
Yeah, it's like, for example, when we think about what from a rational perspective would be absurd beliefs and sort of uh, identity formation by sharing beliefs with other people. I mean, it's not really many times the content of the beliefs that really matters, is just the fact that people are sort of, through those beliefs, creating this shared identity that might happen in religion, for example. I mean, I'm not really sure if many times even people really do honestly believe what they say they believe. It's just some sort of social signaling or something like that. I mean, that's just what I was thinking when I was asking you about functionality. So
Yeah. No, I definitely think that makes sense. Yeah, I think for a lot of narratives, for conspiracies, for some supernatural narratives, we have to take into account the motivations for the individuals investing in them. And not to pull in my own work, or to pull in my own work, in fact, I have this new paper with Leo Fatucci where we argue that one has to consider this in explanations of supernatural belief. That yes, they might be cognitively appealing according to some frameworks. The content might really conform to our cognitive biases, but we should think about the motivation for other people to invest in them, to propagate them, to try to convince others of them, to push them, because they, are potentially tools for trying to influence others' behavior. If I'm like, yo, Ricardo, if you don't share that meat with me, this crocodile spirit will attack you. My decision to share that information is potentially reflecting my own strategic aims.
yeah. Okay, so Dr. Singh, I think it would be all for today. Just before we go, would you like to mention where can people find your work on the internet?
Yeah, so they can find me on my website, manvir.org, manvir.org, and on my Twitter. So that's Manvir Singh without the vowels, MNVRSNGH. That's my Twitter handle. And thank you. This was a fun conversation. Thank you for having me again.
No, it was great, and I hope to have you again on the show somewhere in the future. It's always fun to talk to you.
Yeah. To you as well. Thank you, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.